Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating concept from our source material called the Ancestral source code. Have you ever felt like standard parenting advice just completely misses the mark when it comes to actually equipping the next generation? Yeah, me too. If so, you're going to find this exploration incredibly valuable. We're looking at a deeply strategic blueprint designed for upgrading that critical data transfer between a father and his son. We're going to see how we can completely ditch those ineffective, eye-rolling lectures and instead use your real, lived experiences to build up some serious, resilient mental architecture. It's an absolutely fascinating look at mentorship, vulnerability, and legacy. Let's get into it.
So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with the flawless hero trap, move right into the vulnerable strategist, break down the 3 core training pillars, review the execution checklist, and finally, look at building an unkillable lineage.
All right, Section 1, the flawless hero trap.
To really grasp this blueprint, we first have to identify a massive foundational problem in how knowledge is usually passed down. The source material points out that boys possess this hypersensitive, almost evolutionary radar for fraudulence and hypocrisy. Basically, standard patronizing fatherly lectures, they're completely useless. This brilliantly illustrates the exact difference between a weak approach that just causes a son to tune out and the raw narrative leverage method that actually drives high-focus emulation. I mean, think about the weak approach, an abstract lecture just telling him, hey, you should be disciplined. The result? An immediate, totally predictable eye roll. Why? Because an abstract lecture has zero proof of concept. It feels completely hollow. The data transfer just fails on the spot. But look at the leverage method. By offering a raw narrative, saying, look, here's exactly when I broke, and here is how I rebuilt, you completely bypass that resistance. You're showing vulnerability, sure, but you're also laying out a clear, actionable path to overcoming friction. And that is what triggers genuine emulation.
And that leads us directly to the trap itself. If you position yourself as this flawless, unshakable figure who's never made a mistake, you actually spring a psychological trap right on your own son. Think about it. If you never show your struggles, how on earth is he supposed to learn how to handle his own? He might admire you from afar, sure, but he's not going to actually learn how to navigate life from you. Instead, he looks at his own internal chaos, his deep-seated fears, those inevitable daily failures we all have, and he compares his messy reality to your curated, artificially perfect exterior. And then he wrongly concludes, man, I'm not like my father. I simply don't have what it takes. The perfection you're trying to project is actually creating distance, isolation, and ultimately, it completely fails to transfer the very resilience you want him to have in the first place.
Moving on to Section 2, the vulnerable strategist.
So how do we fix that massive disconnect we just talked about? Well, we need a complete paradigm shift in how a mentor presents their legacy. The crucial move here is adopting this very specific persona, the vulnerable strategist. Listen, this persona is not some flawless superhero. Instead, they frame their life experience sort of like a nerdy scientist who just barely survived a highly dangerous field test. You have to be willing to detail the raw data of your failures, those very real moments of acute panic, and the exact strategic pivots you executed to claw your way back to safety. Doing this completely flips the dynamic. It shifts the relationship away from this rigid boss and subordinate thing to something infinitely more powerful. An experienced researcher sharing invaluable, hard-won field notes with a junior researcher. When a son hears that his hero struggled with the exact same demons, doubts, and anxieties he's currently facing, his internal resistance drops to absolute zero. He leans in. He's fully ready to absorb the data because it's real, and suddenly it's actually attainable.
All right, let's dive into Section 3, the 3 training pillars.
Let's see how adopting that strategist persona actually structures your decades of life context into 3 systematic core training pillars. Your unique experiences, everything you've learned from grinding it out, navigating complex human structures, optimizing your life, it all gets categorized right here. First up is Pillar A, the heavy iron blueprint. This pillar tackles resilience versus cosmic randomness. Now, the core lesson here is a bit harsh, but it is absolutely necessary for a grounded worldview. Basically, bad things are going to happen randomly, despite your absolute best efforts. We have to emphasize the reality that the universe does not have a moral scorecard. It really doesn't care how good you've been. But, realizing this is actually incredibly empowering because it totally destroys the victim mindset. Your physical and mental toughness, your internal framework, is what dictates your recovery velocity when chaos inevitably strikes.
The specific delivery mechanism for this pillar is absolutely crucial. You don't teach this by preaching. No, you teach it by sharing a raw narrative of a time when you had flawless preparation that was just completely wiped out by a black swan event. Maybe it was an injury, a sudden market shift, or maybe an unpredictable betrayal. You tell him straight up, son, I committed absolutely no mistakes and I still lost everything on that field. I sat in my car and my hands were shaking, and then you pause. You let that vulnerability sit there for a second. Then you add, but I didn't cry about fairness. Here is the exact protocol I ran the next morning to reboot my system. See what you're doing? You're teaching him that while bad luck is literally guaranteed in life, an unkillable baseline structure cannot be permanently suppressed.
Moving right along to Pillar B, we encounter the boundary check. This one tackles sovereignty versus the groupthink herd. The vital lesson here is that the crowd will frequently demand compliance, and they'll quickly malign you the very second you dare to think for yourself. Establishing this boundary isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a literal survival skill in modern social dynamics. We're talking about insulating a son against that paralyzing fear of being outcasted, which, let's be honest, is an incredibly powerful, deeply rooted fear for young men today trying to navigate peer pressure and societal expectations.
So how do you teach this one? You share a story from maybe community governance, a tense board meeting, or a pivotal career moment where you had to stand your ground entirely alone. You paint a vivid picture of the tension in that room. You tell them everyone in that room was screaming for a convenient lie because they were exhausted, highly emotional, and scared. But I looked at the raw data and I chose to step aside. You explained to him that it was lonely. The friction of holding that perimeter was intense, super uncomfortable. But then you detail exactly how you stood firm against an emotionally volatile script until the truth finally caught up. This models perfectly how to survive the crushing weight of social pressure without ever compromising your sovereignty.
Then we have Pillar C, the Dopamine Shield. This one focuses on intrinsic value versus the cheap traps of consumption. I mean, we live in an era of algorithmic validation and endless consumerism that's literally designed to extract your time, your capital, and your health. The goal here is teaching your son to do things for the view from the peak rather than settling for the cheap, fleeting applause of base camp. It's all about building a solid shield against those manufactured societal traps that offer instant gratification but absolutely zero long-term fulfillment. By contrasting the empty trap of instant pleasure with a grueling, unglamorous project, you really drive this lesson home. You build the narrative. Share a time when you chased status-seeking consumption, like buying something you definitely shouldn't have just to impress people you didn't even like. And explain how that dopamine rush vanished in a week. It was a totally fake mountain. Then you pivot to the real work. You say, but let me tell you about this boring, painful protocol I ran in total isolation where nobody cheered and nobody was watching. You explain that when there's no audience, you're forced to find your own internal drive. And it's within that quiet, unglamorous isolation that a person discovers the true source of ultimate lasting wisdom.
Okay, moving to Section 4, the execution checklist.
With the theory established and those pillars defined, it's time to look at the exact operational protocols required to get your experiences indexed and ready for real-world deployment. This practical checklist breaks down into 3 actionable steps. First up, build your sovereign log. You literally dedicate a private journal to index 5 to 10 of your crucible stories. For example, write down that time you lost a major client but somehow kept your composure and systematically rebuilt the revenue. Note exactly where you screwed up, how the friction felt, and the specific code update that made you tougher. Second, model the discipline baseline. This is critical, guys, because children have a built-in hypocrisy detector. Your stories mean absolutely nothing if your daily execution contradicts them. They watch what you do, not what you say. You've got to physically live the baseline. Let him see you tracking your metrics, bypassing media noise, staying calm under stress. And third, you must validate his training properly.
Let's look a little closer at that third step because it represents a major shift in how we usually communicate. Instead of throwing cheap, generalized praise at him like, "Oh, you're so smart," you must specifically validate his systemic execution. Why is saying you're so smart a trap? Well, because it promotes a fixed mindset. The very second he encounters a problem he can't immediately solve, that smart identity crumbles under the pressure. Instead, when he successfully navigates a minor crisis or pushes through a really tough training session, you say, "Hey, I saw how you manage your nervous system under pressure today. You handled that terrain incredibly well. Your baseline is upgrading." See, by praising his nervous system management, you promote a resilient, growth-oriented mindset. You are reinforcing a repeatable process, not just the lucky outcome.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Building an Unkillable Lineage. All of these tactical steps we've talked about, the vulnerable storytelling, those 3 foundational pillars, the strict execution checklist, they all culminate in our final objective, hardwiring a psychological architecture that builds an incredibly resilient legacy. By consistently applying this ancestral source code, you're making sure that when life inevitably throws a massive black swan event at your son, he is genuinely ready. I mean, let's picture that moment for a second.
A real crisis hits. The world around him is total chaos. But because of your training, he won't immediately check his phone looking for cheap social media validation. He'll actively avoid the panic-driven answers swirling around in the crowd. Instead, he's going to pause, reach deep into that psychological architecture you painstakingly hardwired into him through shared failure and rebuilt strength, and he will execute his next move with absolute clarity. That right there is the true power of this intentional data transfer.
Ultimately, I want to leave you with this crucial reflection derived from this powerful framework. When the inevitable crisis hits, what specific ancestral code will your son execute? Will it be some abstract lecture he forgot years ago, or the raw, battle-tested data you shared from your own survival? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Start indexing your crucible stories tonight, and I'll catch you on the next one.